Hi, this is a recording for the folks who aren't able to make the workshop. This is the second cannabis equity workshop that the city of Santa Monica will be hosting. My name is David Kaufman. I'm with SCI Consulting Group, which was brought in by the city of Santa Monica to work on this cannabis social equity program development and equity analysis. I'm going to go through the agenda of what I'm going to be discussing in this presentation. We got a little introduction that goes through kind of a timeline. We've got a recap of our cannabis equity assessment analysis, kind of what the community outreach looked like, going through some of the barriers to entry and some of the potential program benefits for the social equity program. And then the next steps, and then we had questions and answers in the live version of this. So going to that timeline, um, basically the social equity program discussion started in June 2023 when there was a study session around the direction led by the city council. And that led to an application for and an award of $40,000 from the state for a grant to do the social equity assessment that I'll be discussing later in the presentation. Moved forward to April of 2024, and the council went forward with the direction to try to discern what the approach would be for the equity program and some of the locational requirements. Then there was a planning commission study session on potential adult use cannabis program development. And then not that long ago, November, we had our first one of these community workshops. And then just a couple days ago, we had one for February of 2025. So going into a little bit of background on what cannabis social equity just is generally, this is a review for folks who've never or not as familiar with the programs. Cannabis social equity is looking to try to help the communities that were impacted by cannabis prohibition and try to work on some of the social, economic, and legal disadvantages that these communities had because of cannabis prohibition. And social equity aims to reverse some of these negative impacts and promote by promoting a fair and equitable set of access to the cannabis industry. Because prohibition was specifically around cannabis, we're trying to go around some of those bad disadvantages folks are having. Moving on to the long-term impacts, these communities had um, based on over enforcement of cannabis related laws, mostly impacted minority communities. There was a loss of property and reduced employment opportunities and a decreased earning potential. You had folks excluded from public benefits like housing assistance or student financial aid. And then the key goals for most of these social equity programs is economic justice, reducing barriers, and community reinvestment. On the economic justice side, you're trying to support individuals who are impacted. On the barrier side, you're trying to address the financial, regulatory, and social barriers. And then on the community reinvestment side, you try to channel some of those resources into those communities. It's one of the more important parts of social equity program, but it's also something that the state has a lot to do with because they have a set aside on the state level to do some of that work. So when you go towards developing a social equity program, you have kind of four steps. You have the outreach and the education side of it. You have a cannabis equity assessment. You have the program development, and then you have implementation. And so we're at almost the program development phase. We're after the social equity assessment phase. We're not at the program implementation phase. So going into some of the social equity analysis findings, there were 2,229 cannabis arrests, and most of these folks happened to have been Black and Latino, and they were disproportionately arrested. If you look at the numbers here on this little graph we have, you have Black African American at almost 5 times the rate of the population, and you have Latino at 1.5 times. So disproportionate impacts there. And then you had the impacted neighborhoods, Pico, Ocean Park, and the downtown districts. If you look at this map, those dots indicate arrests. And you can see kind of where the most arrests are. It looks a little bit more like chickenpox. So moving on to some of the outreach and education, we had an online survey. We had 170 responses. We would have liked a few more, but that's why we also had these community meetings in November and just this past month. And then we had one-on-one stakeholder interviews that we did with folks who came from the industry, who came from the community, diverse group of folks. And then we had these micro grants for community-led discussions. You can see one of the pictures, one of the discussions right here. Um, and then you can see a picture of myself and Kyle at the first meeting. So, a summary of the outreach feedback. So, the majority of folks were in support of a social equity program. It was a slight majority, not as overwhelming as in some other jurisdictions, but not, after all these years, there wasn't as many questions as whether this was something that was still necessary. There still was a cohesive majority who felt that this was something that was still important. And so on the respondent side, 88% of them came from Santa Monica, and 39% work in the city. And 20% of those folks who responded knew someone who was impacted or had a conviction from a cannabis-related offense. The main barriers to cannabis business ownership that were brought up were the local permitting process, high fees and costs, access to capital, and then the strong social stigma and the negative public perception also were impacts. And then strategies that were recommended were to improve access to capital, reduce the licensing fees, some technical assistance, mentorship programs, and prioritizing social equity licensing, and giving opportunities to folks who would meet those social equity requirements. So, diving in a little bit more to what the barriers to entry are, uh, brought up before, but the access to capital. So, you have folks who have just like any business, it's hard to raise money. Cannabis can be particularly hard because of banking, access to real estate. You have folks not able to get, because it's federally legal, not having the same types of landlords willing to deal with it, or they're trying to charge you more than they should. You have high fees and taxes as well. And then on the technical side, you have folks who came from the traditional cannabis industry, wouldn't necessarily have the same tradition, normal non-cannabis business ownership expertise. But then those folks also potentially don't have kind of the licensed cannabis industry knowledge either, the regulatory rules, and they run into problems with that whole permitting process. And then, God forbid, you have a criminal record. Potentially, you had a charge connected to cannabis that wasn't a cannabis charge that's causing trouble. That you were able to get maybe the cannabis part expunged, but not the whatever else. And so there's still a lot of opportunities for folks to get cannabis licensing or work in the cannabis space. They have prior criminal um records. So, regulatory restrictions, you've got licensing restrictions for zoning and setback requirements. And then you have caps on licenses, like a place like Santa Monica, that hopefully social equity folks would get a stab at those licenses once those caps were loosened. And then on the social barrier side, it's still not the easiest thing to go out and work in the cannabis industry. You have folks from the industry having distrust of government, and folks are not necessarily as familiar with some of the opportunities in today's cannabis industry versus 2018 when it was first legalized. So going into the benefits or potential services, break into four categories: financial assistance, administrative assistance, technical assistance, which is going to be a majority of these, and then kind of a catch-all of other services. So on the financial side, these ones are pretty straightforward. You have grants, so potentially the state has some money that they're able to allocate to different jurisdictions, and that those jurisdictions can use microloans. They can use no interest loans. They can use forgivable loans. Uh, for equipment, potentially for lease deposit, for licensing. But the more popular one would be the fee deferral, the reduced fees, because the cities have control over those and kind of can get the um, state rebates. They can potentially have that money go to the applicant and then go back to the city as opposed to it going to a landlord. So you could reduce or waive the fees for businesses that hit the social equity requirements, for licensing, for kind of traditional permitting. You could have deferred payments for after the company has hit a certain revenue number or once they're open. And then there's some training and certifications that they can try to help cover some of those costs, or point people in the right direction of kind of deferred or lesser fees for those training services. But a lot of that ends up coming into the technical assistance side of it. So, moving on to the administrative assistance side, you have the one-on-one guidance with staff as a potential assistance. You have workshops that look somewhat similar to these webinars. And then you have the technical support that we'll get into the next session. And that also ends up a lot of mentorship and networking, end up being somewhat administrative, somewhat technical. Um, and then you have pro bono or reduced cost legal assistance. So you have the business formation side of it, helping folks start their LLCs, their structures, their operating agreements, often get complicated with social equity businesses. And then you've got the contract and the lease review. So you got a lot of predatory lease agreements, folks trying to charge people. The cannabis tax is a cool euphemism known for people charging more than they should. The expungement services side, so people who haven't gotten certain charges expunged that are now expungible under Prop 64. And then on the licensing and permitting appeal side, sometimes people face delays or different hurdles in that application process that pro bono or reduced cost legal assistance could help, and the city can potentially defer some of those costs or defray some of those costs. So one of the biggest categories here is the technical assistance side. So you've got general business development, cannabis business development, compliance and regulatory guidance, workforce development, and networking and mentorship opportunities. So on the general business development side, you've got just your running any kind of business that's a retail business. You have financial planning and marketing. You've got HR. You've got hiring. You've got how do I fund this and deal with cash flow. Um, some local small business incubator type of assistance. You've got kind of leadership and management training. And then you move on to the kind of cannabis specific side of the training. So, how to deal with the licensing and the taxation and the cannabis supply chain aspect of it. You got industry trends and investment opportunities with different potential operators in other jurisdictions, if you're that lucky. And then just kind of the overall networking within folks who are in the cannabis industry that maybe aren't in your jurisdiction. Another technical assistance side would be on the regulatory compliance training side. So you have folks who are able to do some trainings on local, state, and federal regulations. You have different guidance for zoning and local regulations, product testing, how to do track and trace, security, responsible sales practices, and just maintaining regulatory standing, which is quite a job for anybody. So trying to get technical assistance in regulatory compliance can often be a cost savings for these businesses because it saves them from getting fined in the future. Workforce development, so how to train and hire folks and deal with um, how to source from potentially the local community colleges and the workforce development boards, how to potentially hire folks from disproportionately impacted communities, help those folks with resume workshops, interview coaching, and job placement assistance. Because social equity doesn't just mean the folks who are running the businesses, but also the folks who are impacted by cannabis prohibition, who want to work in the industry as well, who might not be able to get a license or might not want a license, right? Or to go through that whole process. And then the last category here, the other services, so potentially expedited application and permitting review. That comes a little bit on the administrative side. Reserving additional permits, so getting into what some of the feedback we had around the licensing of, hey, there's limited licenses. We want to give opportunities to social equity folks to get these licenses, not just to talk about them, but to make sure that there's a pathway for them to apply and open up eventually. Uh, Another thing is that public outreach and education and awareness campaign. So somewhat like these kinds of information sessions, trying to get and these micro grant sessions that we had were good to get folks in the community to tell more folks about this program. But once we have the specifics, I think there'll be another round of potential outreach that could be funded through the state or who knows. Another aspect, Oakland had kind of the shared use incubator apprenticeship program. Sacramento has some level of it as well, where you have existing operators who might have extra space. They rent it out more than they realized, or the industry's changed, right? And so there's opportunities for them to potentially get lower costs with their local jurisdiction, or they're just trying to be good operators. And so that's one option for a place like Santa Monica, potentially ask some folks in LA to do some kind of incubator or shared use facility or some of the existing dispensaries. And then you've got that community reinvestment side. So something we heard in a lot of the input was, right, you want to help folks who are harmed by the war on cannabis. And so the state provides some money, right? But is the city doing enough to highlight how that money's being spent? Is there additional money or tax revenue that would go towards different services? That's been done in different jurisdictions. So moving on to the next steps. So we had phase one and phase two. So we're getting about halfway through phase one of the adopting the assessment. So we're almost done with community outreach. We have one more, I think, interview we're going to do. We've got the draft assessment and analysis. We're getting close to the end of that. We're going to have the final assessment report in spring. That's going to go to council, and the report's going to get adopted in the summer. And then we move on to phase two of the adopting the program and implementing the potential services that would go towards a social equity program or the licenses that would be available to social equity applicants. So that's all I've got. If you have additional questions, please feel free to email here. There's this website as well from the city that's got a good amount of information on it. I think it's got the first one of these videos as well, and we'll be posting additional information and videos as the program continues. Thanks so much for watching this.